Magnus Schaefer is an art historian based in New York. In 2011, together with Valerie Knoll, Hannes Lochinger, and Julia Moritz, organized the exhibition dealing with some books, visuals, and works related to American Fine Arts Co. at Halle für Kunst und Kunstraum der Leuphana Universität in Lüneburg, Germany. His writing has appeared in Text zur Kunst and catalogs including Alibis, Sigmar Polk, 1963 to 2010, Michael Kreber, The Ridiculized Snails, and Das Institut, Kirsten Brach and Adela Roeder, Triennial Report 2009 to 2011. He is currently working on a monograph on Ole Hahn, which will be published in early 2015. He is also a curatorial assistant at the Department of Painting and Sculpture at Museum of Modern Art here in New York. And one last note before I hand Magnus the mic is that our exhibition is closing this weekend, so if you haven't been able to see it yet, there's much more at Green Street, and I hope you can spend time with that. And also, if you're interested more in Colin DeLand and the American Fine Arts Archives, we also published an interview with Ann Butler today on our website in which she talks about the gallery and the archives and this sort of relation between the two. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Magnus.
Thank you for the introduction, Nicholas, and thank you all for coming. One thing that I should maybe add that Nicholas didn't say is I also, along with Alex Gartenfeld and Julia Bleitman, cataloged and documented this library in 2006 and 2007. So I've kind of known this material for 6 or 7 years. My talk tonight, I chose the title Revisiting, and that is actually why I chose the title Revisiting DeLand's books, is that I have this relationship with these books that's dating back to 2006-07, and I've been coming back to them occasionally, and this is a very nice occasion to do this again. So when coming to someone's house for the first time, it is a quite common impulse to at least casually scan the titles of the books on the person's shelves in the hope of being able to draw conclusions from the books about their owners' tastes and interests. What has, since 2007, been exhibited on various occasions in Berlin, Munich, Paris, Lüneburg, and now in New York as the Colin DeLand Library seems to inevitably lend itself to triggering this impulse. It comprises some 2,700 items, mostly books, but also magazines, invitation cards, and miscellaneous printed matter from the estate of the late New York art dealer Colin DeLand, who died in 2003, and from the holdings of his gallery, American Fine Arts, which existed from 1984 to 2004. DeLand is, of course, what may be considered a legendary art dealer, and legendary is in quotation marks. The posthumous image of him that is suggested by photographs, obituaries, and recollections of his friends and contemporaries may even make him a somewhat mythical figure, and mythical, again, in quotation marks. American Fine Arts has frequently been invoked as a model of a gallery that operated within the institutional framework of the art market, albeit not necessarily in compliance with its standards. During the 20 years of its existence, the gallery provided a space in which commercially or institutionally successful sculpture and installation work, institutional critique, and trash and slacker aesthetics could coexist in productive ways. While some artists, including, for example, Mark Diane, Peter Fendt, Andrea Fraser, Christian Philip Müller, or John Waters, showed regularly at American Fine Arts, the program of the gallery developed and shifted continuously over the course of its 20-year existence, suggesting that American Fine Arts was more about experimentation than about a streamlined commercial identity. DeLand also maintained a low-key profile as an artist, exhibiting under the monikers J. St. Bernard and John Dog. The latter may or may not have been a collaboration between him and Richard Prince. And he also collaborated with the group Art Club 2000, which was comprised of then students at Cooper Union. What makes American Fine Arts attractive from today's point of view is perhaps that the exhibitions and diverse other activities in and around the gallery seem to add up to many loose ends while satisfying desires for style, integrity, and content. When I wrote about the Colin Deland Library in this book, Dealing With, which was published on the occasion of the exhibition that Nicholas mentioned, I attempted to trace aspects of the history of American fine arts and of what I assumed to be Deland's interests and tastes by highlighting thematic groups of books from the library. And I will also just refer to it as the library as a shorthand for the Colin Deland Library. One finds more or less comprehensive materials such as catalogs for solo and group shows, magazine articles, and invitation cards on many of the gallery's artists in the library. They are often labeled as gallery copy or archival copy, or simply with a sticker with the artist's or the gallery's name. Such materials indicate the context in which the gallery's artists showed and offer some conclusions about which artists and discourses were most prominent at which times. There is, for example, a rather comprehensive selection of catalogs that documents the early European reception of some of American fine arts, American fine arts artists who worked with context and site-specific practices. Tom Burr, Mark Diane, René Green, and Christian Philipp Müller were included in Projet Unité in Firmenich near Saint-Étienne in France, an exhibition organized in 1993 by Christian Philipp Müller himself and Yves Aupetit-Taillot in Le Corbusier's 1954 Unité d'Habitation, which was realized, the building itself was realized in the context of a social housing project. Also in 1993, Diane and Fraser participated in an exhibition on taking a normal situation and translating it into overlapping and multiple readings of conditions past and present at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Antwerp, again organized by Aupetit-Taillot here in collaboration with Ivona Blaswick and Caroline Christoph Bakargiev. As described in the introduction to the catalog to that show, the artists in the exhibition make art which participates in discussions deemed most topical now that the political, economic, and territorial Cold War world order has crumbled. They incorporate research practices in their work and focus on, quotation, the heterogeneity and splintering of contemporary society, as well as the formation of cultural identities and the functioning of structures and institutions in society. 2 years later, Müller, Burr, Ursula Biemann, who, like Burr, was a fellow in the Whitney Independent Study Program in 1987-88, and Mark Diane were invited to exhibit at Kunsthalle Zurich. The resulting exhibition, Platzwechsel, addressed the topic of public space based on works related to the Platzspitz Park in Zurich, a site that had been frequented by heroin users in the 1980s and was eventually redeveloped as the drug policies in Switzerland got stricter. Other publications in the library hint at the gallery's connection with the Cologne art scene around Christian Nagel Gallery in the early 1990s. There are, for example, the first few volumes of Texte zur Kunst, which was then published in German only, and catalogs and publications by Martin Kippenberger or Cosima von Bonin, who had a show at American Fine Arts in 1993. There are also a number of publications by the now somewhat obscure K-Raum Daxer in Munich, where many artists from Cologne showed. And there is a catalog of the 1993 Unfair, an alternative fair parallel to the established Art Cologne, in which American Fine Arts participated. If these books, and this is just a small sample of what's in the library, if these books clearly had a function within the more conventional commercial operations of American Fine Arts, others must have been for private reading and entertainment. In her 1992 hybrid interview and essay, Another Kind of Pragmatism, a portrait of Deland interwoven with an analysis of the interior of the gallery's 40 Wooster Street location, Andrea Fraser cites Deland as saying that he enjoys science fiction, adventure, and thrillers, and one indeed finds a number of titles in the library that confirm this penchant. One may also assume that he or somebody else at American Fine Arts liked reading biographies, as there is a whole range that runs the gamut from celebrity gossip to historical documentation, or from Claudia Schiffer to Marcel Duchamp, to mention some names. The problem with identifying such groups of publications is that it ultimately says more about my interests and sensibilities than it does about the collection of books that we now know as the Colin Deland Library. The library is everything but what would be considered a well-curated bookshelf, assembled in order to signify a particular taste or certain intellectual pursuits. One can, of course, look for and single out catalogs and names of artists, but attempting to reconstruct a coherent history of American fine arts and of the artists associated with the gallery would prove to be a futile endeavor, as the library does not function as a coherent archive of the gallery's activities. For example, although Colin Deland was heavily involved in Art Club 2000, the group that I mentioned earlier, and the group had several exhibitions in at American Fine Arts in the 90s, there's very little, if no material, about their activities in the library. And another example, the catalog to the exhibition, What Happened to the Institutional Critique, which was, I think, an important exhibition for the gallery in 1993. There is no material on that exhibition in the library. So the library itself is very fragmented and definitely not comprehensive. So this is not to say that the library is of no interest for research on American fine arts and the context the gallery operated in. Quite the opposite, especially since some of the books are marked or include notes, letters, or additional information. However, the library cannot stand alone, but has to be considered together with the gallery's archives that are now at CCS Bard in upstate New York, and the photographic material owned by the Archives of American Art in Washington, D.C. And still, what do the mere fact that the library includes several cookbooks or numerous crime novels say about either Deland or the gallery? And why not mention, to choose some random examples, Continental Drift, a 1999 book by Emily Apter, or Model Patient, My Life as an Incurable Wise Ass, Embracing the Chaos of Life-Threatening Illness with Style by Karen Duffy, or Simon Grannon and Christopher Sperandio's Cartoon Hits from 1996. I could go on citing random and not so random examples, and for some of them I would be able to offer some kind of context, while for others I would be short of explanations. When I wrote about the library in 2012, I thus asked if there was a different way to relate the library to what we know about the gallery's practice. I've referred to Fraser's aforementioned essay, Another Kind of Pragmatism, and suggested that her definition of pragmatism actually offered a model for understanding the composition of the library. She offers descriptions, in her text she offers descriptions of the interior of American fine arts, as well as the organization of the space and the character of the various objects she encountered there. While Fraser relates, Deland did aim for a particular aesthetic or ambience for the interior of his space. His choice of furniture was not defined by a certain style or design, but rather by functional and economic aspects. He went for the cheapest and most practical items, as Fraser describes it. Some of them he sourced from various places, including discount or used office stores. Others he built himself from particle board, itself a cheap and functional material. Bricolage is the term that Deland used himself to describe this approach to furnishing the gallery. In the office and the storage areas, the gallery accumulated a host of objects, artworks or parts of artworks, knickknacks and souvenirs that people gave to the land, as well as even more mundane items such as a bottle of aspirin, dog food, or socks. According to Fraser, DeLand claimed that he did not make decisions about what ended up there. She quotes him as saying, "Things just come in, and you place them, and either they stay or they don't." One can describe the library in similar terms, beginning with the shelves. These shelves here, they are the original metal shelves, and they're sturdy and rugged, of the kind you'd expect to find in a warehouse or workshop rather than a gallery. And they are of a similar but not identical build, again suggesting a primate of the functional over the aesthetic. Quite a few of the books still have price tags that advertise special deals, and along with the literally cheap, one finds numerous publications that cover a spectrum of low culture, extending from pulp novels to self-help books and obscure special interest magazines and zines. The cheap may have provided the best value, but these books also suggest a sensibility that enjoys the low as much as it understands it as a cultural phenomenon, which is how DeLand describes his relationship to Las Vegas in Fraser's portrait. The sense of a somewhat erratic and to some degree arbitrary accumulation rather than collection of books and printed matter in the library is akin to DeLand's observation that things just come in and either stay or go. Furthermore, books that relate to gallery business, personal research and entertainment, exhibition catalogs, novels and cookbooks stand side by side, which seems to suggest a parallel to how American fine arts has been described as a space that encouraged discourse and social interaction, as well as questioning of all sorts of art production and distribution. This side of experimentation and this side of experimentation and questioning that American fine arts provided is, of course, now history. And it is gradually being historicized through anecdotes, exhibitions, and art historical research. The Colin DeLand Library is implicated in this ongoing process of historicization of the gallery. It may to some extent even be a product of it. With American fine arts ceasing its operation, the gallery's inventory of books and printed matter shifted from the mode of flux and ongoing accumulation to that of a more static historical object. The bulk of material in the library is from a period spanning from the mid-1980s to the early 2000s, making the collection a Warholian time capsule of sorts, as Alexander Schroeder, who bought the books in 2006, once remarked. Andy Warhol famously collected all kinds of printed matter and small objects that went through his hands in so-called time capsules, boxes that he sealed, dated, and stored away. The Colin DeLand Library, in its current form as a historical object, offers a snapshot-like glimpse of art, popular culture, technology, graphic design, and other cultural currents in the last decade of the 20th century, as filtered through the lens of a particular segment of New York's art scene, albeit not necessarily directly related to American fine arts. This is the time of graphic designers getting overly excited about the newly available digital tools and pre-social media, the time of graphic designers and the time of pre-social media, cyberspace, fantasies, and dystopias. It is the time of site-specific works and discussions about architecture and various kinds of institutional structures in relation to the formation of subjectivities. And it is when Bernadette Corporation published Made in USA, funded in part by American Fine Arts. All of this plays into the attraction that American Fine Arts possesses from today's point of view. And it is certainly one of the reasons why the Colin DeLand Library is attractive. And maybe this attraction is not unlike that exerted by advertisements in old magazines. After Alexander Schroeder bought the books in 2006, They were set up at Mehringdamm 72 in Berlin, at the time a semi-private space for exhibitions and related events, where they were available for visitors to browse and read. In May 2008, the collection of books was on view at Kunstverein Munich as Colin Deland's library, which is the first time that this title actually appeared, to my knowledge. And then the title got eventually stuck with the books and is now more or less the official title. Although one could kind of discuss if it's really the right title to actually refer to it as the Colin Deland Library, or if it should rather be American Fine Arts Library, as some of the books clearly relate to American Fine Arts, and American Fine Arts certainly wasn't run by Deland alone, although he was the main person behind it. The context of that 2008 show at Kunstverein Munich was a series of lectures, workshops, and screenings titled Some Neighbors, which revolved around non-commercial or artist-run spaces on New York's Lower East Side and situated Colin Deland, and by implication American Fine Arts, in the context of more recent spaces such as Dexter Sinister and Orchard. The latter was organized, among others, by Andrea Fraser and Christian Philipp Müller, who also had a long-standing relationship with American Fine Arts. The library was shown again in early 2010 in Paris at the apartment of the art dealers Daniele Balice and Alexander Hertling, again in a semi-private setting comparable to the one at Mehringdamm 72. And again, the books were available for reading as they were in Berlin and actually at all consecutive presentations of the library, which I think is an important part to how the library is being presented these days. Then, as Nicholas mentioned in the introduction, in 2011, Valerie Knoll, Hannes Leuchinger, Julia Moritz, and myself organized the exhibition dealing with some books, visuals, and works related to American Fine Arts Co. at Halle für Kunst and Kunstraum der Leuphana Universität in Lüneburg near Hamburg. We decided to approach American Fine Arts largely through documentation, archival material, and miscellaneous ephemera, supplemented by works by Art Club 2000, John Dogg, J. St. Bernard, and others, as well as in a separate exhibition space, contributions by Stefan Dillemuth, Loretta Farnholz, Karl Holmquist, and Philipp Zach. And when we showed this material and these works, we aimed for an open-ended, deliberately fragmentary account of the various activities that happened at or around American Fine Arts, treating the gallery as an example of, rather than a model for, a set of practices which existed within or in relation to the framework of the art market. Which existed within or in relation to the framework of the art market, yet allowed a working around a total acceptance of its imperatives. We also included the library, which we understood to be a part of the inventory of the gallery, and a document that offered an extraordinarily comprehensive, albeit partially oblique, overview over the discourses in which American Fine Arts was involved in one way or the other. We presented it as being a document among others and emphasized that there is nothing precious about it, as we sensed that the collection of books lends itself to being perceived as an object in its own right that signifies the cultural prestige of being in the know about American Fine Arts. And that comes with all the implications that I sketched earlier, that American Fine Arts is and has proven to be very attractive as a model for contemporary gallerists and artists in thinking through possible relationships between art practice and the market, and also that the model, this American Fine Arts as a model, has been mined and exploited over the last, I'd say, decade in various contexts. And so now the the library is on view here at Artist Space, actually just a few blocks away from the gallery's Wooster Street location, 10 years after the gallery closed. The library vaccine, the current exhibition at Artist Space, focuses on art's distinctive relationship to the book form and its singularity, and its that is a quote from the press release. Art's distinctive relationship to the book form in its singularity and in its states of reproduction, distribution, and accumulation. In this context, the presentation of the Colin DeLand Library again raises questions about its legibility as a collection of books against the background of the historical context in which it was assembled, as well as about the relationship between the whole of the collection and the individual items that constitute it. Which, by the way, is why I suggested having this projection here. It usually is over there on that table, so it always runs while the books are up. And when the library was documented, the artist Julia Bleitman took photographs of every cover of every book cover and every object in the library to document it, and there is a database actually of it. And so yeah, this actually is probably, I think, the best way to kind of see or get a sense of the different kinds of material in the book, in the library, and also the, I guess, just visual appeal of the covers. What the presentation here does explicitly, and I think rightly, is that it treats the library as an artifact, and as it has become an artifact over the last couple of years through being presented in this series of exhibitions that I mentioned. And against the background of the history of American fine arts and the desirability and attraction of the gallery, the library is prone to function as a pars pro toto for the plethora of subjects and practices associated with American fine arts, as it promises to condense or at least reference them in a tangible object whose very structure even suggests that what has been identified as some of the key characteristics of the gallery. Consolidated into the form of a library, the idiosyncratic mix of publications that equally offers a context for astute critical inquiry and random pop and subcultural detritus is, as such, by now already historically coded as attractive through the association with its former owner. The library is an extremely valuable archive and research resource, both in terms of its composition and the vast amount of period information it contains. However, without the kind of context provided by other historical resources, it remains opaque to some degree. So it will be interesting to revisit the books again once the gallery's archives at CCS Bard will have been fully processed and will be available for research, which I think is probably next year. So they acquired it and are currently processing it, and I think they should become available soon. That is what I had to say. I thought, since we still have some time, I would just give, even though I said it's only of limited, so basically when I wrote this text, I tried to rethink my text that I wrote for this book, and what I did in this book is I extensively looked at different groups of books in the library, and since I'm not sure if all of you actually had a chance to see the library and to spend some time here, I thought that although it is lacking context, if I'm doing it now, I still wanted to just give you some brief examples, or some more examples actually, what one finds in the library, which also works together with that presentation. So I did mention the exhibition catalogs. There are also it's worthwhile to mention there are books from Pat Hearn's archive. Pat Hearn was Colin Deland's partner, also a gallerist, who died in 2000, so 3 years before Deland. And he actually moved into her former space in Chelsea. And during that move, some books from her archives must have ended up in these books, which also testifies, or which also shows that the library, or again, questions this naming of the library as the Colin Deland Library, as there is so much more actually that exists in it. There is, I mentioned the biographies. There's also actually a large group of philosophical and theoretical texts which kind of also, yeah, basically offer a background to the gallery's activities. So, not surprisingly, but still interesting, there is a Benjamin Buchlow's, for example, Benjamin Buchlow's collection, Neo-Avant-Garde and Culture Industries. One of my favorites because it has a dedication which is just the traces, lipstick traces on it, so somebody kissed the book and gave it to Deland. And this also is just one of the examples of why it is important to actually look at these small things, but also show, I mean, look at the individual objects, but also shows how oblique these things are, as I have no idea who gave him that book and why this dedication is in there. The other thing is that I mentioned Made in USA, this magazine that the Bernadette Corporation published. There are also several issues of Purple magazine, which happened around the same time at a similar intersection between the art world and the fashion world. And there are also older zines in there. There's a zine that I don't know much about and I would love to learn more about. It's called Pig Magazine, which seems to be from the early 90s. And if you compare Pig to Made in USA and Purple, you can really see what I mentioned earlier, this shift in graphic design and how actually the availability of digital graphic design tools changed the way that people made magazines. And Pig is really just, looks more like a punk scene and is actually collaged and made with a photocopy machine. Whereas Made in USA kind of still retains that aesthetic, but shifts it in a more digital realm. And so this really just, yeah, shows this shift in kind of the period style, which is really visible also in the way that exhibition catalogs, in the exhibition catalogs that are in the library. And there is, as I mentioned, there is a huge group of biographies which I found interesting, and there are a lot of cookbooks which I also still haven't figured out why they were there. There's even one that has a gallery sticker on them, so I assume there must have been some connection between the cookbook as a form and the galleries, some exhibition at the gallery, but yeah, I haven't figured that out. Yeah, so I guess that's really it. Thank you.